Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to our Ubiquity Talks, where we talk with people of note, we talk with people of influence, we talk with people who are profoundly shaping the world around them. This time, I am delighted to be able to talk with my old friend, David Pearl. The thing I like about David is whenever I'm in his presence, I feel better and I become more optimistic. and I think David it's just the way you are. It's the frequency of your soul and your body and your mind and your heart. But everyone, I'm just delighted today to be able to engage in dialogue with an old soul who is completely contemporary. He's an Englishman, and what I found most intriguing about David, with which I'd like to start this dialogue, we both went to Cambridge, and when I was at Cambridge, we used to go over to King's College and listen to the boys' choir at King's College. And those of you who've heard any of the Vienna Boys' Choir or the boys' choir at King's, you know that these little boys sing with such piercing clarity and such extraordinary, I would say, aliveness, that it's among the most beautiful singing in the world. And that's how our David started. He was a little prodigy, and he sang in choirs. He was noted for the brilliance of his singing at a very, very early age. And I would say, David, as I know you and I have read your biography and hear your stories, it was really your capacity for song that launched your life and launched your career.
Well, I'm going to say first, it sounds like being at the Oscar, as you describe this person. I'm very touched that you give me this build-up. But thank you. I so enjoyed spending time with you, Jim. So thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, the truth of it was, I come from a Jewish background, so I wasn't too much in churches, although I have sung in churches. But I was a kid in a school in London, and I had a loud, piercing, perhaps, not necessarily angelic voice, but there was a teacher at the school who was a lover of opera, and she spotted me and took me along to Covent Garden, which is the opera house in London. And when you're a kid, you don't know this is unusual. I was 8, and I was standing in the opera house singing my 3 loud notes, and they gave me a job. And I became the boy soprano at Covent Garden. And it turned into, when I look back, as you say, it wasn't really just an introduction to music, it was introduction to something else. Because I had this extraordinary first experience where I sang in an opera called Tosca by Puccini. And in the third act, there's a shepherd boy that sings in the mountains outside this prison. And in the prison, the tenor is having his final moments before being executed. So it's quite Italian. And I sang my little song, and then a guy put his hand on my shoulder, big guy, because I was in I look up and there's this big Italianate looking guy. And he says, bravo. And then walks on stage and sings. And it was Placido Domingo. It was his first performance at Covent Garden. He was 30, I was 9, 10, 9. And as he sang, my life changed, really. It was like, I can remember very distinctly, it was like my head was, like in aquariums where there are fish, they're sort of independent, but every so often they all turn at once, like in a coral reef. And that happened with my brain. It just heard that sound, that concentrated beauty, and pointed that way and said to me, that's real. When I look back on it, it wasn't saying, oh, that's amazing. It was like, I knew the adults had been lying to me, that there was something they weren't telling me. That's that's what they haven't been telling me. And it's sort of, looking back, it set my baseline for what was real from that point onwards. So I have a high expectation, and also a little bit of, ever since then, a kind of skepticism when people say to me, get real, or it's real. I'm always like, really? So I think it was a real Kickstarter in many, many ways, but it's as fresh today as it was then, many years ago.
What made it real for you? What was it about Placido Domingo's singing? Was it the quality of his tone? Were you opened up, sort of like when the opera singer reaches a certain note and the glass breaks? What made that experience real for you in a way that it reshaped your life? What was going on inside?
Wow, great question. Thank you. God, and of course, I don't really know, but it wasn't volume. I think it was intensity and concentration of lifefulness. You know, it was this, and even now when I hear opera, there's a sort of intensity to it that isn't to do with volume or spectacle, but it's got to do with a kind of a boiling away of peripheral stuff into this kind of intensity of feeling, intensity of sound, intensity of beauty, intensity of, not always beautiful. And I think that the little boy in me had this appetite for the essence of things. And there was something about that. Funny, because people often think opera is very artificial and sort of not like life. And in a way, of course it is. It's kind of crazy and melodramatic. But in there, running through the middle of that is something that I recognized as a kid as life. That's life. And it's very hard to put into words. It's great you ask, because it's been something that has been kind of beguiling me and leading me all the time since, which is this little search for these moments of life. We'll come later on perhaps to talk about street wisdom, which is a kind of my latest exploration of that in the least operatic setting possible, you know, in the street, or ordinary urban street. But there's something for me, this kind of this appetite, like a little truffle dog looking for these moments of life. And I think that's what it is. Yeah, I think it was that.
Well, you know, it's so interesting because in the Gospels, it said in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You know, Pythagoras said that at the heart of the universe is sound, and that, in fact, the whole cosmos is a poem, he said. It's a song. The different planets have sounds. Each one of our bodies has a sound. So what the great singers, you think of, you know, Aretha Franklin, you think of Caruso, you think of Placido Domingo, Pavarotti, you know, they pierce our hearts because of the rarefied quality of their sound. And the sound, like a mantra, you know, if you think of Om Mani Padme Hum, a sound that has motivated the entire culture of Tibet. There's a sound that's associated with the Dalai Lama. The Om Mani Padme Hum is his sound. And so it's so fascinating to me that your whole life was activated by sound. So that means it's sound, like an artist that's drawn like Michelangelo to stone, to marble. You've been drawn to sound, and I'd love to just track that just for a few minutes, because that's what you began to immerse yourself in from a little boy, certainly, but into your teenage years. You began to sing more, at both at an amateur level and a professional level. Tell us more about that, and what was beginning to be carved out in your soul through your mastery of sound.
Great question. Well, so I love the word career, because even though people to present it as though, in an academic situation, they say career, and it has that word like a straight line, like Route 66. It's going to go to the horizon like it's a career. It's straight line. But of course, if you look in the dictionary, it tells you to career means to crash in an uncontrolled manner down the side of a mountain. So it's much more like that, much more zigzaggy. So I have, boy, if I zigged and zagged. But the sound, as you say, it's kind of, at times it's been more faint, sometimes it's been stronger. And I went through a very big zag, but when I was in Cambridge, when I was really plowing the academic furrow and so on, became very unhappy, actually technically had a breakdown, which I think was undeniably my breakthrough. And in the psychiatric hospital, where I was good fortune to spend a bit of time, and I mean that, I had soak time, it was a grand piano. And again, I found myself day in, day out, playing the piano and singing to the patients. It was kind of a little bit, who was singing for whom, I'm not sure. But there was something about that outpouring of sound, singing a sound and hearing the sound played back to you and giving the sound to others and stuff that was essential there. And I didn't fall straight back into opera. In my 20s, I was working in advertising, and I had a show on the BBC, and various things happened. But this itch, I think I teach a lot of story, and I think about the protagonist's itch, this itchiness that's sort of saying, sing, sing, sing. And I started going back to opera. I sang in choruses initially, and then I sang smaller parts. And then I think what I was trying to do was to get back to Covent Garden, which is a whole different prospect. When you're a kid, it's one thing. When you're an adult, it's a whole other thing. And then at some point, I realized that actually wasn't what I wanted to do. Didn't want to emulate Domingo, and how could you? I wanted to do something else. And I went to a circus. There was a vogue for sort of new wave circuses, and I saw it was called it was pre-Cirque du Soleil, but it was that kind of. It was called Archaeos, and there was a woman hanging from her feet, singing, twirling around and singing. And I'd been told as a kid, to sing, you must stand still and hold your hands up. And I thought, hang on a minute, hang on, what's going on here? And so it's a long story short, I set up a circus opera company. And through my 30s, it was the joy of my life. With my friends and ensemble, we studied physical opera, highly physical opera on trampoline. We made our own operas. We did operas based on Brecht. We went around the world, and this wasn't just the sound. Then there was the body. And as a little boy, I'd been very stuck in my head, I think, and very into it. But it to awaken this body in go to circus school and stuff is that sort of, those two things together really again opened up another level.
Yeah, and then that led to your being contracted to do large scale events, and then you began to segue into more corporate consulting as you discovered that these insights and these perspectives were actually what the corporate sector needed in a world in which corporations are ruling in ways that the kings and priests ruled during the medieval and archaic period.
Yeah, I was approached out of the blue by a company. Listen, I shouldn't tell you, but it's only you and me listening to this, right? But it's a company called McKinsey. Just don't tell. But early 90s, and they were a company that see me on the television. I had a show about music, and they were asking exactly as you said, which is there anything we could learn from the arts to help us do two things? One was to connect with each other in ways we wouldn't have dreamed possible, was one brief, and the other was to look at problems differently. And I had no idea, but of course I said yes. And it resulted in a 1,500 person opera that they created and performed and costumed, and they did all the work. We found out who played instruments, and they made up the orchestra. And I realized I tripped over another level, which was as much as I love performing, there was a real beauty to allowing other people to taste that life by singing, by performing, stage fighting, whatever it is. And this was the beginning of the arts and business movement, I think, certainly in the UK. We were amongst the first to be doing that. And that has, as you say, rolled on through my work ever since. And I still, to this day, I mean, I've just come from a business event where, to a greater or less extent, I'm dipping into my experience of the arts and weaving that into the everyday, if you like. Because again, I think opera and conventional performance kind of disintermediates or rather disaggregates us into audience and performer, which is great. But I'm more interested in the performer that's in all of us, and the art of the everyday. I think that's and so that's really what I'm doing now, which is there may not be much singing, but in some ways, what we're doing is conjuring the voices out of people, as you put it. Yeah.
Well, and I think that insertion of the artistic and the aesthetic, the quality of beauty and harmony into a corporate structure based on rationality, competition, and a zero-sum game is a dramatic way to consult. And I think one of the reasons why, whenever I talk to someone about you, the word passion comes up because I think it's your dedication to the artistic impulse that has allowed you to feed your soul in such a way that when you bring it into a corporate setting, which is as arid as a desert in most cases, with skillful means, you've been able to activate that which the corporate sector normally kills off in order to be competitive. So you've really lived out a contradiction and a dialectic. It's sort of like right brain, left brain. Say a little bit about how you've navigated, how you've understood that process and challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about Apollo and Dionysus a lot. The Apollo, the accountant, and Dionysus, the kind of party animal. And I think that one of the great things about drama and the arts is they're very tolerant of both, whereas business tends to be very focused on the Apollonian. And I was very puzzled about this when I first started working with businesses, that they seem to be focusing on questions which right, wrong answers and yes, no things. And I often say to people now, I said, especially if you're senior in business, you shouldn't be concerning yourself with those questions that have right, wrong answers. You should be sitting in the fire. As Arnie Mindell said, you should really be sitting in the middle of dilemmas, questions that don't have a right answer because they've got several right answers or several wrong answers. And I found that, over and above the aesthetics of the arts, there were certain things from the arts that are taken as normal, which are very unusual and quite freeing when you bring them in. And that would be one, this notion of don't spend your time asking questions that have right answers. Just sit in the unanswerable. You're never going to answer to be or not to be. That's not the point. The point is to sit in the paradox, in the dilemma. Another thing which the arts do that the business world struggles with is, I don't know what you might want to call it the shadow, you might want to call it the downward line of the hero's journey, or whatever it is. But helping people alter their relationship to what looks like difficulty is one of the things that I think the arts can help with, because there's a part of, I don't know when it happened in education, but a lot of people I meet in business are trying to ascend on an uninterrupted, smooth line, ideally a parabola. Yeah. And we know in our lived experience that actually this oscillation between the light and the dark, if you want to call it that, is not only natural, but it's invigorating. And that's another thing. And this word passion, I'm gabbling a bit, but that you do that to me, Jim. This word passion is an interesting one because I think it's a bit of a vogue for businesses to want passion from their people. And I often counsel them just, careful what you wish for, because as we know, the word passion means to suffer. And that kind of, that's what Italian tenors do, and they suffer, and that's where the voice comes from. But if you want to get passionate, then I think you have to have the whole thing. You have to look at it, the whole of it, and often, businesses are less tolerant of the more difficult, awkward, messier side of the passion, the suffering side of it. They just want the result, if you like. This word performance again is used a lot in business, and I'm cautioning people. What we want is great performance, not high performance, because high performance is a proxy for just continuous performance. So this, I think that the arts, without realizing it, because I came to the arts first, it's just a little bit more holistic. And I will say, I want to acknowledge the genius that is Ken Wilber. I was watching our previous talk, and not at all intimidating, by the way, to have to follow you and him to be the second talk. There's a bar to live up to. But I came across Ken's book, Brief History of Everything, in a bed and breakfast in Peru, where I was on tour singing, of course. And when I started reading that, I thought it's kept me, the integral approach has kept me sane, I think, through my work in business, because I try to remember the objective, the subjective. I try to remember that there's a whole picture, not get sucked by the business into the right-hand side of the holon, which is all about the more visible world. People want stuff they can hold in their hands, but in fact, a lot increasingly now, as well as we're seeing in this world, that the way it's developing now, I see businesses splashing around and having to discover what this invisible, intangible world is about, the world of spirit, the world of the world of relationships, the kind of that inter-subjective world, which is actually the key to whether an organization holds together and grows. It isn't any more to do with the size of their factory or their, the more solid aspects of it. I don't know where that got us, but that was great.
Well, no, I mean, I think as you go into the interior of a company, you go into the interior of the psyche and soul of chief executive officers, CFOs, etc., activating their passion, that's also the realm of ethics. And one of, I think, of the great challenges and contradictions about the corporate sector in the world today is that they operate in a winner-take-all mentality where ethics are laid on the sideline. And I'm just wondering how you, as a sensitive soul, has grappled with big consulting companies and big companies that objectively are doing some fairly serious damage to people and planet for the sake of profit. How do you wrestle with this in your own heart? How do you try to address it in your work with the corporate sector? It's the question of ethics, the relationship between activating passion and activating ethics. Do you see them as integral, or do you see them as ultimately separable?
Well, I think they're separable, but at a cost. I don't think, I don't think they should. Let me see if I can answer. It's a question that troubles me continually. It used to trouble me in a kind of existential way, where I would find myself thinking, I've got to, I'm in the wrong place. I shouldn't be here. And I would go do more performing and then think, I shouldn't be here. And I had quite a troubled path, sort of trying to find out where I should be. And I've accepted that I'm a hybrid kind of, I bridge those worlds. And I remember saying I met a lama, not the beast, but a Tibetan holy man. And I asked him, I said, am I just sharpening the shark's teeth for money? I mean, I sold out and so on. He said, no, you need to bring the light into the dark. Now that's a very kind of, self-regarding thing to be saying, but I do feel like certainly 10 years ago, I felt like I was chipping away person by person. I just thought, look, just see if you can create some doubt in people's minds. Plant a seed here and there. Just see what you can do. I will say in the last few years, the tide feels like it's turning. That conversation of the integration of ethics and the profit principle, or the revenue generation, but generation of value, has become much more one that my clients will bring up rather than me have to bring it up. There's an urgency, especially with younger business leaders, for that to try and find ways to knit it up. There may be some design reasons why that's not possible. And sometimes I feel we may be kidding ourselves, like Chomsky will say, if you're a sane person working in an insane system, you become insane. And so there are some corporations that are just poorly designed for that knit. But I am noticing the clients I work with, also I'm now more selective. So I really want to work with clients that are on that journey. And increasingly, I find myself in situations where you can't really tell the external from the business person. It's much more of the conversations are, you'll find numbers of people, all of whom are kind of productively lost, all trying to find their way. And I found that gratifying. That might just be my perspective, but I do feel there's a groundswell of questioning, big questioning, not least because the old models aren't working. They're consuming the world, they're destroying the world, and people can only ignore that with incredible amount of effort.
Yeah. Well, that's a very perceptive answer. It's like you were saying earlier, living in the contradiction, what Jung called the antinomial nature of reality, where you can have two internally consistent, mutually exclusive truths, and you hold them, and thereby, that's pathos or passion. You experience the crucifixion of the ego, because there's something about us that wants something to be right or wrong, but there's more fundamentally something about life itself that doesn't lend itself to those easy dichotomies. And it's our insistence that life does that causes a major part of our suffering. And in that regard, let me segue now to street wisdom and your journey in the midst of all of what you were doing with your art and your corporate advising and your major events. You had an experience that gave birth to street wisdom. Tell us that story.
Wow, how long you got? Well, I'll be brief but respectful to honor the source of this. I think it's difficult to know where ideas come from. They certainly don't come from, in my experience, not from me. They come through me, perhaps, and often from the space between you and me, Jim, or the person I'm working with. They emerge from space. But there's a place that you and I both know called Damanhur, which is I describe it, well, it's difficult to describe, but imagine a sort of eco-kibbutz, scientific, spiritual living experiment in the Italian Alps, which I've been connected with for 30 years. And as part of one of the processes I was doing there, produced this fragment of a clue about what I might do with myself, and it was walk in circles in public places. It's a long story, but this is a fragment that was floating around my mind, and I thought it was probably a metaphor of poetry, but in fact it was an instruction, and it took me about 7 years to figure out that it was an instruction. So I started. One time I was kind of puzzled about what came next for me, so I thought, you know what, try it. So I went to Leicester Square in London, and I started walking in circles in that public place, and it was revelatory, because I discovered that, I mean, let's face it, walking in a circle is a definition of futility, right? And so it's quite a hard thing to do. So I started a big circle, yeah, and I thought, no, I'm just kidding myself. So I made it a smaller circle. And as I walked in a smaller circle, two things happened. The first is I felt like I looked stupid. And then it occurred to me, I don't know how I look because I don't know what's in their mind. That's a projection of mine. And I'm saying I look stupid. And that's stopping me doing this circle. So as Auguste Boal says, the copy's in your head, right? But the second thing I noticed that as I walked around, my perception was no one was looking. There was I concerned about.
Nobody cared.
Nobody even saw Jim. And the reason is because, this was my understanding anyway, the reason people they were looking but they were not seeing. If you look at people in the street now particularly, they have what we call in the opera world snake eyes. So the tenor's on stage and he's supposed to be looking into the eyes of his beloved and looking into it, but in fact he's looking into his brain going, oh my God, there's a high note coming up. And you get this kind of glazed reptilian eye, not looking look. That's the look you see on the street because people aren't looking, they're thinking. And it made me think, hang on a second. If you can be on the street and you can disappear, it's like Harry Potter's cloak is real. The street could be an amazing place to be exploring human nature, uncovering new aspects of yourself, doing some of the stuff that I'd taken business people off to exotic places. Why not just try it in the street? And I didn't realize I'd fallen into an old tradition, the flaneur tradition of sort of late 19th century Paris, where poets would jump into the street and disappear into the crowd, Baudelaire and so on and so forth. And it wouldn't let me go. So I started working in Amsterdam, where I know you spend time, and just experimenting with a colleague of yours, Peter Merry, and many other friends, and Esperide from Damanhur. And bit by bit, a shape emerged. And it really took years to do this, but a shape of a kind of experience in three parts with a sort of stage where you heighten your senses so you can really connect with the world around you and the wisdom that's around you. Second phase is sort of a mini quest where you go for a wander and you ask a question, mantra style, and you see what the street tells you. And a third phase where you share that with others. And I formed this into what I call a workshop and gave it away. Basically made it available online and so on. And who knew? It's become probably the biggest thing in my life, certainly at the moment. It's in 40 plus countries around the world. There's been between 600 and 700 events, and they're all completely free because I felt, like I say, we don't pay fees, we pay attention. It's the street, it's all there available. We shouldn't charge for it. But what we do say to people is, when you do street wisdom, share your story. That's the kind of token of exchange. So that's the kind of story of it. But it's been a revelation, really, because if we go back to the early me standing on the stage at Covent Garden, I thought that you needed the ropes and the costume and the red velvet and the Puccini to find that bright essence of life. But guess what? Actually, it's there all the time. You don't have to fly to Machu Picchu. And by the way, it's not sustainable that we do fly to Machu Picchu. Why not tune up and do pilgrimages on our own street? Find the divine, find the magical on your doorstep. That's been the exploration for the last few years.
Yeah, gotcha. It's so fascinating that you realize that in the street, people are not looking outward, which is what you assume because they're navigating through the external world. They're completely caught up in their internal dialogue. And that's the source of wisdom, therefore street wisdom. And it's just worth noting, everyone, that that's the origins of Greek philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle were always in the marketplace having conversations literally in the street. And that's why Plato's philosophy is not a rational, logical construction, which it defines most modern philosophy, but dialogues. And those dialogues is what happens when two people encounter. If you read the story of Plato's dialogues, it'll say, you know, I was going down to such and such a town, and I fell into conversation. And they just record their conversation. So it's illuminating to me, David, that you would stumble on in the midst of Leicester Square
Yes.
the origins of philosophy itself in the Western tradition. So that's very exciting. And you know, as everyone knows, Ubiquity is partnering with Street Wisdom because Ubiquity is founded on this Socratic dictum of know thyself, and that the unexamined life is not worth living. And Socrates was considered wise, if you recall his story, because he was the only one aware that he did not know. Mm-hmm. The rest of them thought they actually did know. And so the oracle at Delphi pointed to Socrates as the only wise man in Athens. And I'd be very interested, David, in just hearing just how does like a typical Street Wisdom event work? Because as you say, this is open for everyone, and we're hopeful that all of you listening would take this as an incentive to go out and create your own Street Wisdom. So just describe how a typical one works.
Yeah, well, I'd be delighted to. Just before I do, because I'll lose it in the flow, but I just wanted to say that one of the things that if you do Street Wisdom, it's worth bearing in mind is that you're not walking through a street, you're walking through you, as we say. It's like, because people will come back, 10 people, 20 people will come back from the Street Wisdom experience and with very, very different experiences of that same area. And it's a way of thinking about it is that, of course, you're not really walking through reality, you're walking through your version of reality. So what you see there, what speaks to you is you speaking back to you. I just wanted to mention that because it's something that occurred to me over time, and it can be very touching when people see that. Anyway, let me answer your question, which is so it's simple. You know, it took a long time to get simple. I love to make things. We all do. We love to make things complicated, but it's super simple. And imagine a typical Street Wisdom event might be somebody that's interested in doing it would download the instructions from the website. They would choose a street
What's
corner.
What's your website?
And
streetwisdom.org.
Oh, sorry, yeah, thank you. Streetwisdom.org, thank you. Vanessa and Mark and Rachel will be happy you prompted me to say that. So you download the instructions, you get in touch with us, and we say hi, and we see how we can help you. But basically, you choose a space, somewhere and a time, and typically it takes 3 hours. So usually people do a morning or an afternoon one. And then the site cleverly publicizes it for you, and anyone who wants to come along, and usually they're strangers, but sometimes it's friends. And typically a Street Wisdom event would be 10, 15 people. And what happens is the facilitator, the leader, the street, we call them wizards, street wizards, would take you through a series of 4 short walks. And they're walks where you keep an instruction in mind, a simple instruction, like it could be, so one of them is to slow right down. And they all seem very simple, but in fact, not the instructions, the way they're done and the sequence is very carefully thought through over many years, and they have a cumulative effect. So you do these 4 short walks. People just fan out and do short walks for about 10 minutes, following these 4 instructions. And these, as they walk through the streets, for example, slowing right down, it alters their relation to the outside world. It awakens our embodied intelligence and sensitizes us. I describe it as a bit like logging in to the internet that's all around you. And then the second phase is like putting a search term in. In other words, activating all of this wisdom. You ask a question. And so people come to Street Wisdom, they may have a question in mind, but the facilitator would encourage them to find a question, and will often say, like, not too big, not why am I here on earth, or you could ask that, it's a bit big, and not too trivial. And it could be about work or whatever you want, but it's really usually related to a choice that lies ahead. Typically it's that. and it could be a navigational choice, like, should I take this job or should I go this way, and so on and so forth. You ask the question, and then for an hour, people go for a wander by themselves. They could do whatever they like. But we just encourage them to notice what the street tells them in answer to their question. And the street speaks back to you in a myriad of ways, obviously. You know, some people will see a sign on the wall. Some people will hear a snatch of music. Some people will taste something. Some people will bump into a stranger, as you were saying, Jim. That dialogue can get very physical, because very often, people synchronistically, and you talk about this in the book that's coming out, we'll come to that, but very often you meet exactly the right stranger at exactly the right time. Somebody who has the answer to that question, and there's innumerable examples of that. But anyway, during the walk, people are registering answers to their questions, and then the final phase, they meet at another point, usually a cafe, and then the facilitator brings them together, we have a cup of tea, and then there's really only two questions: what happened, and what, if anything, did you learn? If anything, because we find sometimes people are pressure themselves to be perfect and come up with great answers. And there's enough pressure. We all have enough pressure in life. We don't boss anybody into having seen the Buddha, as it were. And that's essentially it. Sensitizing, we call it the tune-up. You're tuning into the world around you, the quest, and then the sharing. And that turns out to be enough structure to reliably connect people, whether they're skeptical or not, whether they've been to Skiros or not, whatever. Just regular folk following that process seem to have extraordinary results time after time after time.
Over the years, is there a particular experience that somebody's had that you would offer as a way just to exemplify how extraordinarily profound this simple experience can be?
Gosh. I'll give you, if I may, I'll give you one. It's in a TEDx talk I did. But one, and it's close to home, is my daughter. So I don't think she'll mind me sharing it. Elsa was 14, and she was at the edge of teenagehood and nervous about that, feeling she should go to parties and yet at the same time nervous about the implications. And so she went off, and her question was, how can I be more comfortable being less comfortable? Not a bad question for a 14-year-old. And she wandered off. She was part of an event that we were running, the East End of London, and she wandered off, and she found herself on a deserted street. It was a Sunday, it was light rain, and she found herself in front of a poster, which was actually, technically, it was about the dangers of unlicensed minicabs. And it was put up there by the police, and a phrase jumped out at her, and it said, "Remember, not everyone is as nice as you. Always know your way home." And this "always know your way home" had a sort of highly significant meaning for her. And she thought, wow, I've got my answer. And then she looked up, and the shop she was standing in front of was her name. It was E. Pearl. Her name was Elsa Pearl. And every hair stood up on the back of her, head. She felt she'd been spoken to by the world, and it was making an absolutely deliberate message to her. Now, she didn't know she'd wandered into the Diamond District in the East End. She didn't know that. The Hatton Garden. But that kind of message, and then a kind of operatic, almost like, did you get that, is very, very common. And there's innumerable. I use lots in my book. I'll give you one other example, if I may. And again, it's close to home. I just feel comfortable sharing those that are close. My sister, Jenny, who may actually even be watching this, my sister is, I would say, has a healthy dose of skepticism. She's not a hippy-dippy, but she came along, and it was like, my sister's come. Your family don't spare you. If it isn't working, they'll tell you. And her question was, what am I going to do when my final child leaves home? And she has 6 children, 6 lovely children, but it's quite a tribe. And what's she going to do when? So she goes out, and it was again raining. It rains a lot in London. And she's tuned up, and as she's walking down the street, she's noticing how the water is coursing out of downpipes, guttering. And she noticed one of them, the water's coming out in an odd way. So she reaches in, which she wouldn't normally do, pulls out a book, a journal that has been shoved into this pipe. And at this sharing, she comes back and she puts it on the table in front of us. And we said, what's the book? She said, oh, I found this book. We said, well, what is the book? She said, oh, it's a diary. I said, well, whose diary? And she said, it's a woman's diary. Come on, Jem, which woman? She said, well, it's a woman, it's a middle-aged woman whose children are leaving home, and she's thinking about what she's going to do about that. And amazing. The rest of the people in the sharing were dumbstruck. But what often happens for the participant is they're like, yeah, it's just a book. They can't necessarily at the moment see that this is quite an interesting synchronicity. So those are the kind of things, those admittedly were both close to home, but the joy of street wisdom is going onto Twitter and seeing, or onto Instagram and seeing one in Mexico or Buenos Aires, where I can't affect the outcome. They're not members of my family, and similar sorts of things are happening.
Yes. Well, and it's a beautiful partnership that we're beginning to form, everyone, between Street Wisdom and Ubiquity. And we're hopeful, if any of you want to participate more, to go up on Ubiquity's Ubiverse, which is our community platform, where just like you could do on Facebook, it's really an alternative to Facebook, where no one's going to sell your data. You'll have privacy, but with all the benefits of a community platform. So Street Wisdom will be partnering with us in building community on our Ubiverse. And we're very excited, David, over the next several years to expand this partnership, because I think you stumbled onto something very profound. It is not ultimately in the churches, in the schools, in the august institutions of government that wisdom lies. It lies in the streets. It lies in the ordinary homes of ordinary people, and how we take advantage of this, and how we come together to deepen our dialogue with one another, so that the synchronicities that captured your sister and daughter can abound in all of our lives. That's the essence of any kind of a learning institution. So I want to applaud you on that. And then finally, just ask you about your new book. You've written a number of books, but I know you're very excited about the one that you're just finishing up and will be coming out in January. Tell us about it.
Oh, thanks, Jim. The book is called Wonderful. And I kind of heard the title and thought, oh, I better write the book. I mean, genuinely, I thought that's a really good title, because it kind of says what it is, which is there's a wonder in wondering. There's a wonder in wandering, sorry, brain. And what it is it's a book that's based on what I've learned in street wisdom over the last 5 years, but also in a way it's a kind of compendium of what I've learned since I was a little kid. In fact, it starts when I'm a little kid singing. And it really slows down, it focuses in on what's happening in a street wisdom walk, and just kind of wanders through that idea. So for example, there's a chapter which the lovely Jim helped me with, which was about synchronicity. Like, why do you bump into people? And we sort of, the reader and I, we wander through this subject together. There's one on how to change your tempo. There's one about direction finding using your physical intelligence and so on. And so there are these, they're little wanders. It's as though we're wandering through the subject a little bit, perhaps like Socrates. And then in between, sandwiched in between, are little strangers that you bump into. So they're people that I've been privileged to meet in my life, and we bump into them when we go for a walk. And Ken Robinson's there, and Charles Handy's there, and Esperides there, and it's like we are joining this stranger as we walk through the streets and picking up some wisdom from them. I'm very excited about it, not because I didn't feel like I wrote it. I just feel like it wrote itself, and it's a gathering of some wonderful people, including you, Jim, and I can't wait to get it out there.
Well, good. Well, David, one final question, and then we'll bring this to a close.
Your questions are big questions, Jim.
These are serious times.
Oh,
and actually,
yeah.
this is what as you face the future, given the rich experiences that you've had, which have garnered, I would say, deep wisdom in you, and you're now being called upon to counsel increasingly important companies and institutions. What quality of soul do you offer us, and as we bring this particular dialogue to a close, what quality of soul do you think is of seminal importance at a time of escalating hypercomplexity, at a time when the global crises like climate change are literally spinning out of control, at a time when in your country and my country, government dysfunction is deepening, not getting better? What do we need to fortify ourselves to face the future and successfully navigate meaningful lives?
Oh, that's an easy one. I tell you what, it's a great question, but I tell you what comes up for me. And I am troubled. In the book, I cite Madeleine Albright, who describes herself as an optimist who worries a lot. And I'd like to think that would I resonate with that. But the answer that came up from as you were talking is the soul that exceeds our body. And that's to say, the soul that joins you and me and joins everyone on this call. One of the real thing I learned writing Wonderful was it ends, to my surprise, I didn't expect it to, but it ends at the bedside of John Donne, the Dean of St. Paul's, who died in the 17th century, a metaphysical poet who wrote the meditation, No Man is an Island, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for me. And I ended the book took me there, and on that is the kind of closing note. And I think I'm touched deeply by that, because what he's saying, it's a phrase that's often, I think, misused, but what he's saying is, when he says, ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee, he's saying, when you die, I die. When you're hurt, I'm hurt. That we are inextricably, intimately, and completely interlinked. And I think that my experiences on the street, including some pretty hostile streets within the West Bank and various places, is this dawning sense that you're not alone. And I think that we're going to need each other in ways that we haven't even dreamed yet. And it's our soul. It's our soul that we need, not my soul or your soul. I think that's what's coming through at the moment anyway.
Good. Well, David, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure as always. And hopefully we'll see each other soon on some street corner or other, stumbling around searching for wisdom.
Thank you for having me. It's been a joy. Anytime, Jim.
Thank you, everyone. Bye, David.